In the forgotten hills of eastern Kentucky, where morning mist still clings to valleys that time seems to have abandoned, there exists a documented case that has puzzled historians for nearly 2 centuries. In 1834, the Reverend Ezekiel Morrison and his 9-year-old twin daughters, Rebecca and Rachel, arrived at the remote Baptist congregation of Pine Hollow, a community so isolated that maps of the era barely acknowledged its existence. What happened during their 3-day stay was meticulously recorded in the personal journal of Pastor William Phillips, a document discovered in 1987 when the old church was finally demolished. The journal entries describe events so precise, so unnaturally accurate that modern psychologists have studied them extensively. Yet none can explain how 2 young children could possess knowledge that defied every rational explanation. The Morrison twins didn't just predict future events. They revealed secrets buried for decades, described people they'd never met, and spoke of tragedies that occurred years before their birth. But perhaps most unsettling of all, every single detail they revealed proved to be absolutely verifiably true. This channel isn't for everyone, only for those brave enough to confront mysteries that challenge our understanding of reality itself. Before we dive deeper into the Morrison case, make sure you're subscribed because we're about to uncover details that most historians refuse to discuss. And tell us in the comments what state are you listening from. Because what happened in Kentucky might have happened closer to your home than you think. The story begins not with the supernatural, but with something far more unsettling: the possibility that some human minds can access information in ways science still cannot comprehend. The Kentucky of 1834 was a land caught between wilderness and civilization where communities like Pine Hollow existed in virtual isolation among the Cumberland foothills. This particular settlement had been established in 1818 by 3 families seeking religious freedom away from the denominational conflicts plaguing larger towns. By the time the Morrison family arrived, Pine Hollow consisted of barely 200 souls, most related by blood or marriage, all bound by the strict Baptist doctrine that governed every aspect of their daily lives. The community centered around a modest wooden church built with their own hands using timber from the surrounding hills. Pastor William Phillips, a learned man who had abandoned his comfortable life in Lexington to serve these frontier souls, maintained the only written records of births, deaths, marriages, and significant events. His meticulous nature would prove crucial in documenting what was about to unfold. Ezekiel Morrison was a familiar figure along the circuit of remote churches scattered throughout the Appalachian region. Tall and weathered with prematurely gray hair that spoke of hardships beyond his 34 years. He traveled on foot with his daughters, carrying only a worn leather satchel containing his Bible, a few personal items, and the journal where he recorded his spiritual observations. He had been widowed for 9 years, ever since his wife Sarah died giving birth to the twins during a terrible winter storm that had isolated their cabin for weeks. The girls, Rebecca and Rachel, were striking in their identical appearance, yet completely different in temperament. Rebecca, born first by mere minutes, possessed an outgoing nature that drew people to her immediately. Her smile was infectious, her laughter genuine, and she spoke with the confidence of someone far older. Rachel, quieter and more observant, seemed to exist in her sister's shadow. Yet those who looked closely noticed that she often began sentences, that Rebecca would finish, or answered questions directed at her sister before Rebecca had a chance to respond. What made the Morrison family particularly noteworthy among the circuit preachers was Ezekiel's reputation for bringing spiritual renewal to struggling congregations. Stories followed them from church to church, tales of backsliders returning to faith, of communities resolving long-standing conflicts, of spiritual awakenings that lasted for years after their departure. Some attributed this to Ezekiel's passionate preaching, but those who observed more carefully noticed that the real changes often began after private conversations with the twins. The journey to Pine Hollow had been particularly difficult. Late autumn rains had turned the mountain paths into treacherous mud, and Ezekiel had been forced to carry Rachel for the final 5 miles when she developed a fever. They arrived at sunset on November 15, 1834, just as Pastor Phillips was concluding evening prayers with the handful of congregants who attended weekend night services. Phillips later wrote that his first impression of the family was one of profound weariness, not just physical, but spiritual. Ezekiel's clothes were traveled and patched, his boots worn thin from countless miles of mountain paths. The girls clung close to their father. Rachel still pale from her fever, Rebecca's usual brightness dimmed. by exhaustion, yet something in their eyes, an alertness, an awareness that seemed inappropriate for children their age, made Philips feel inexplicably uneasy. The congregation of Pine Hollow had extended hospitality to many traveling preachers over the years. But there was something different about the Morrisons from the very beginning. That first evening, as the family shared a simple meal with the Phillips family, Rebecca asked the pastor's wife about her garden, specifically inquiring whether the roses by the eastern fence had recovered from the blight that nearly killed them 3 summers ago. Mrs. Phillips had dropped her spoon, staring at the child in amazement. The rose blight had indeed occurred 3 years prior, devastating her prized flower garden, but it was not something she had mentioned to anyone outside the immediate community. When pressed, Rebecca simply smiled and said she had dreamed about roses while walking, and somehow knew that Mrs. Phillips grew the most beautiful ones in the county. This incident recorded in Pastor Phillips's journal that very evening would prove to be merely the first of many that would challenge everything the Pine Hollow community believed about the natural world. The next morning dawned gray and cold with a bitter wind that rattled the windows of the small cabin where the Morrison family had been given shelter. Pastor Phillips rose early, as was his custom, to prepare for the day's sermon. He found Ezekiel already awake, sitting by the dying embers of the fire, his Bible open, but his eyes staring into the distance with an expression of deep concern. The girls had disturbing dreams last night, Ezekiel explained when Philips inquired about his troubled demeanor. They often dream of the places we're going to visit, but these dreams were different, darker. Before Philips could respond, Rebecca appeared in the doorway, her hair disheveled from sleep, but her eyes alert and focused. "Pastor Phillips," she said in her clear, childish voice, "in your church, beneath the 3rd floorboard from the altar, there's something hidden that shouldn't be there. Rachel dreamed about it, and I dreamed about why it's hidden." The pastor felt a chill that had nothing to do with the morning air. He had indeed hidden something beneath those exact floorboards, a bottle of whiskey that represented his ongoing struggle with temptation. Not a soul knew about it. He had placed it there during a moment of weakness 3 months prior, telling himself it was better to keep it close, where he could resist it daily, rather than to remove the temptation entirely. It was a secret that shamed him deeply, one he had confessed only to God in his private prayers. "What exactly did you dream, child?" Philips asked, his voice barely steady. Rachel emerged from the shadows behind her sister, moving with that peculiar, silent grace that seemed to characterize her every action. "The bottle is brown," she said softly, "and it's wrapped in a piece of cloth that used to be a baby's blanket." "A blue blanket." Philips sank into his chair as if his legs could no longer support him. The cloth was indeed a remnant of a baby blanket. The blanket that would have belonged to the son he and his wife had lost in infancy 5 years earlier. He had wrapped the bottle in it as a reminder of his failures, both as a father who couldn't save his child and as a pastor who couldn't conquer his own weaknesses. Ezekiel watched his host's reaction with an expression that mixed sympathy with a weary familiarity. "It started when they were very young," he explained quietly. "At first, I thought it was merely childish intuition, the way young ones sometimes sense things adults miss. But, as they grew older, their insights became more specific, more impossible to explain through natural means." That Sunday service would be remembered by every member of the Pine Hollow congregation for the rest of their lives. Ezekiel's sermon was powerful, but not unusual for a circuit preacher. A passionate call for spiritual renewal and confession of sins. It was what happened afterward that defied all rational explanation. As the congregation began to file out, Rebecca approached Samuel Turner, a prosperous farmer known for his generosity to the church and his standing in the community. She looked up at him with her innocent blue eyes and said, "Mr. Turner, the money you've been taking from the church collection isn't really stealing if you put it back, is it? Papa says God forgives those repent." The color drained from Turner's face. For 6 months, he had been skimming small amounts from the collection plate to cover debts from a failed investment in a Louisville business venture. He had told himself he would replace every penny once his financial situation improved, but the missing money had been eating at his conscience like a cancer. Before Turner could respond, Rachel moved to stand beside her sister, and addressed Martha Whitfield, the elderly widow who served as the church's unofficial moral authority. "Mrs. Whitfield, your husband didn't die in the farming accident, did he? He's still alive somewhere, and that's why you hide the letters." The elderly woman swayed as if she might faint. Her husband had indeed abandoned her and their children 15 years earlier, taking their savings and disappearing one night without explanation. She had fabricated the story of his accidental death to preserve her dignity and her children's future in the community. The letters Rachel mentioned were the occasional correspondence she received from him pleading for forgiveness and describing his new life in Missouri. She had never spoken of them to anyone. One by one, the twins moved through the congregation, speaking quietly to various members. To Dr. Hayes, they mentioned patients who had died under his care due to his lack of proper medical training. To the Miller family, they spoke knowingly of the son they kept hidden in their attic, a young man whose simple mind made them ashamed before their neighbors. To young Thomas Brett, they described in detail his secret meetings with Elizabeth Carter, the married woman whose husband traveled frequently on business. Each revelation was delivered with childlike innocence, without judgment or malice, as if the girls were simply sharing observations about the weather. Yet the accuracy of their statements was so precise, so impossible that the congregation stood frozen in a mixture of terror and awe. Pastor Phillips watched in horrified fascination as his orderly community was turned inside out by two 9-year-old children who spoke of secrets that should have been known only to God. But it was Rebecca's final statement that would haunt him for the rest of his days. She walked to the front of the church, stood before the altar, and placed her small hand on the wooden cross that had been carved by the church's founding members. "This is sacred ground," she said, her voice carrying clearly through the silent sanctuary, "but it's been stained by what happened here before. The Whitman family didn't die in a house here, did they, Pastor Phillips? They died right here in this very room. And some of you know exactly why." The silence that followed was deafening. Even the wind outside seemed to have stilled, as if nature itself was waiting for someone to respond to this impossible accusation. The revelation about the Whitman family struck the congregation like a physical blow. Pastor Phillips, his face pale as morning frost, gripped the pulpit so tightly his knuckles went white. The Whitman tragedy was Pine Hollow's deepest secret, a wound that had never properly healed despite 16 years of collective silence. In 1818, when Pine Hollow was still a struggling settlement of barely 50 souls, the Whitman family had been among its most prominent members. Jacob Whitman served as both blacksmith and unofficial leader, while his wife Mary was known for her skill with herbal remedies and her gentle way with difficult births. Their twin daughters, Hope and Faith, had been the community's darlings, bright, beautiful 9-year-old girls who sang in the church choir and helped their mother tend to the sick. The official story, the one recorded in 0 hours 15 minutes and 9 seconds, Pastor Phillips's predecessors carefully maintained records, stated that the Whitman family had perished in a tragic house fire during a winter storm. Their bodies had been found in their home's remains and they were buried in the church cemetery with appropriate ceremony. The community mourned, rebuilt, and moved forward as frontier communities were forced to do when tragedy struck. But Rebecca's statement suggested a far different reality, one that several of the older congregation members had hoped would remain buried forever. Elder Thompson, now 73 and one of Pine Hollow's founding families, slowly rose from his pew. His arthritis made movement painful, but his voice carried the weight of decades when he finally 0 hours 15 minutes and 57 seconds spoke. "Child," he said, his words measured and careful, "you speak of things that happened before you were born in places you've never been. How could you possibly know about what you claim to know?" Rebecca turned to face him, her blue eyes holding an unsettling maturity. Faith Whitman had a birthmark on her left shoulder, she said quietly. Hope had one on her right ankle. Faith always carried a wooden doll that their father carved, and Hope wore a silver locket with their mother's hair inside. When they died, Faith was wearing her blue Sunday dress, and Hope was in her night gown because she had been ill with fever. These details, impossible for a stranger to know, sent a murmur of recognition through the older members of the congregation. Elder Thompson's wife clutched his arm, her eyes wide with recognition and fear. The night they died, Rachel continued, her voice soft but clear. It wasn't a house fire that killed them. They came to the church seeking sanctuary because someone was hunting them. They hid behind the altar. But they were found anyway. The church had grown so quiet that the sound of breathing seemed unnaturally loud. Pastor Phillips found himself remembering fragments of conversations he had heard over the years. Whispered words that stopped when he entered a room. Meaningful glances between the older members when certain topics arose. 0 hours 17 minutes and 32 seconds, the way some families always left flowers at an unmarked spot in the cemetery. Samuel Turner, still shaken by the earlier revelation about his financial transgressions, stood up abruptly. "This is madness," he declared, though his voice lacked conviction. "These children are speaking nonsense, making up stories to frighten us. There's no way they could know such things." But even as he spoke, other details began emerging from the congregation. Mrs. Carter, Elizabeth's mother-in-law, whispered something about blood stains that had appeared on the church floor. Years later. Stains that couldn't be cleaned no matter how hard they scrubbed. Old Benjamin Foster mentioned the strange sounds that sometimes echoed from the church late at night. Sounds like children crying that had been dismissed as wind through the loose boards. Dr. Hayes, despite his earlier embarrassment about his medical qualifications, found himself speaking up with clinical precision. "I've always wondered about the church's foundation," he said slowly. "When I helped repair the eastern wall 3 years ago, we found what looked like, well, what could have been bone fragments mixed with the original mortar." The implications of his statement hung heavy in the air. If the Whitman family had indeed died in the church, if their bodies had been secretly interred within its very foundations, then every service, every prayer, every moment of worship had taken place over their unmarked graves. Ezekiel Morrison had been standing silently throughout these revelations, his weathered face showing deep concern, but no surprise. He had witnessed similar scenes in other communities, watched as his daughter's impossible knowledge unraveled, carefully maintained lies, and brought long-buried truths into the light. "Mr. Morrison," Pastor Phillips said, his voice strained, "how do your daughters know these things? What manner of gift allows them such insight?" Ezekiel was quiet for a long moment, studying the faces of the congregation. Before responding, "I've asked myself that question every day for years," he finally said. Their mother, Sarah, claimed to have the second sight, the ability to sense things beyond normal perception. But what the girls experienced goes far beyond anything Sarah ever demonstrated. They dream of places they've never seen, speak of people